Hi everyone, I'm Jen Lucas, Managing Editor of the Knitting Circle and Craftsy contributor, and I want to welcome you to today's exclusive live event. I'm joined today by Karina Ferguson, who is a knitwear designer, and she is going to be showing us how to make the Raglan sweater ornament, which is a super cute little ornament that you can make for holiday gifts, or you can just make one because it's super fun to make. So if you haven't done so already, you're going to want to make sure that you download the pattern. You're going to find the pattern in the chat wherever you are watching this from. So just make sure to look for that link so you can download the pattern and make one for yourself. Speaking of that chat, if you have any questions along the way for Karina about the project or about knitting, be sure to drop those in the chat box as well, and we will get to as many questions as we can over the next hour. And so that is it for me. So let's go ahead and say hello to Karina. Thank you for joining us, Karina.
Thank you. I am so excited to be here.
I am so excited to have you here. It's been a long time since you and I have been together in person, so I'm very excited that you're going to show us how to make this today. So why don't you, before we talk about the ornament, why don't you tell me a little bit about how you got into knitting and maybe sort of how you made that transition from hobby to job?
So I didn't learn to knit as a child. I learned to crochet. And then as an adult, we moved away from Ohio down to Florida, which is not where you should learn to knit, by the way. You should learn when you're still in Ohio and it's cold. But when we moved to Florida, I became a stay-at-home mom, and then my kids went to school. So I needed a hobby. I learned to knit. I started working at the local yarn store, which was walking distance from where we lived at the time, and eventually started teaching classes and then designing patterns. And now I've got a couple of books, and I used to be the editor of a magazine, and it just, you know, keeps going.
Just kind of snowballed, really.
Just really snowballed. But I will say that I've gotten so many of my best friends from knitting, and I was like super excited. I'm like, they're going to bring me to Minneapolis where it's cold, but I get to see Jen.
Yes,
so.
yeah, like I said, we haven't been together in a very long time, so it's really great that you're going to be showing us how to make this today. So do you want to tell us maybe just like a little overview of this project and sort of what everybody can expect in their PDF download?
So you're going to have a PDF that's going to have the instructions for all three versions of the sweater that you see here. So this is the basic version of the sweater, and Jen made this one for me in the super cute rainbow yarn. So this is just self-striping rainbow yarn that made it all like super adorable. So basically, you're going to have all three patterns, but we're going to walk through the basic one. You're going to start at the neckline. You're going to do the increases to make the shoulders and stuff. Then we're going to do the body and the sleeves. And the nice thing about this little Raglan ornament is they're super fast. They use scraps of yarn. You can hang them on a holiday tree. You can make a garland out of them. If you make them the right size, they can go on a doll. But it's also perfect practice if you ever want to learn to actually knit a Raglan sweater top down and you've never done it, because all the steps are the same and you're doing it quick and easy. So we're going to walk through all of that. The first thing I want to talk about is the materials that you need for this. Like I said, you can totally use leftovers. For these versions, we used about 60 yards, 55 meters of fingering weight yarn. And then you're going to want a way to work in the round. Now, I prefer to work in the round with long circular needles, but I'm also going to be demonstrating this with our double pointed needles. So we're going to get started and go through all the steps of how to make the mini sweater.
Yeah, this is great. And you can see here, even just looking at Karina's little samples, so I knit the rainbowy one and you knit the other ones, which are the other versions of the pattern that are in your PDF. And you can see sort of our gauge wasn't quite the same. My sweater came out a little bit smaller, but that's good because the gauge is not critical with this.
You know, when we talk to knitters about gauge, we always talk about how important it is to have the correct gauge to make something that's going to fit the human that you intend it for, or to not run out of yarn. But with these little guys, as long as you have a fabric that you like and you've got enough extra yarn, you're going to be fine. So
yeah, I agree that this particular project is probably not one where you're going to be making a gauge swatch first, because your gauge swatch is just basically your sweater.
Basically your sweater. So I've got bigger yarn and needles, so it's easier for y'all to see. And basically what we do for this is I use a long tail cast on just because that's my favorite cast on. You can do any cast on that you like, because it doesn't matter if the sweater neck is stretchy enough to fit over somebody's head, because there's nobody head involved. So I'm just going to cast on a few stitches here because I want to show you how we do the ribbing. The ribbing for this sweater, I do a knit one through the back loop ribbing. And the reason that I use that is because I'll pick up one of the sweaters here and show you. It's just a lot neater when you're looking at the knit one through the back loop. It twists the stitch, and you can just use a regular knit one, purl one ribbing, but I like that through the back loop.
Yeah, I do too, and especially when it's like this small fingering weight yarn, and it's kind of like, it's not at a tight gauge, but it is a little bit tighter than like if we were doing shawls. You and I make a lot of shawls out of fingering weight yarn.
And loose,
but
yeah.
when you have that sort of tighter fabric, it's nice to have that knit one through the back loop, I think too. I like the way it looks.
So just a quick demo to show you the knit one through the back loop. It's just exactly what it says. So instead of going into the front of the stitch, you're going to insert your needle into the back of the stitch and just knit it. And that's what's going to twist it. And then we purl the second stitch, and then we do another knit one through the back loop. And we're going to do that all the way around. And it's only 16 stitches that you're casting on, but that's what's going to make that nice twisted crisp ribbing that I really like. So I want to show you, when I cast on for the double points, I just cast on onto one needle, and then I set it up so that I'm ready to work it in the round. And this method of working in the round is the method that I prefer, even for small circumferences, which is, they call it the magic loop. And if you're ever looking up, I think we have stuff on all the sites that talks about magic loop. But basically, it allows you to not have the double points. I sometimes refer to using double points as wrestling a porcupine. So we've got this all set up, and what we're going to do, if you're using double points, you're going to have so many stitches on each needle. But if you're not using double points, if you're doing something like the magic loop or 2 circs, you're going to want to add some stitch markers so that you know where your increases are going to go. So I'm going to separate this out and do that. So there are 16 stitches, 8 on each half. I call it a needle half when I'm talking about the magic loop. So after the first 3 stitches, I'm going to put a marker. And I always suggest that you use a marker that's a different color than your yarn, just because it's easier to see and you know what you're getting into. So then on the other side, I'm also going to put a marker after the 3 stitches. So what that does is, if those are on separate needles, like on the double points, you would just have 3 stitches on one needle, 5 stitches on the next, 3 stitches and 5 stitches. So that would be sleeve, front, sleeve, back. So, but when we have it like this, I just have it so that I'm ready to go. So I want to show you the increase that I use for this. You can use kind of any increase you want for this because it's not super fancy, but one of my favorite increases lately is just the make one by doing a backwards loop cast on. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to knit the first stitch, and then I'm going to show you the backward loops cast on, and it's super easy. So we've got our needle tip here, and we've got our working yarn, and we make, I always call it a cursive E, and then I'm reminded that some people don't learn cursive anymore. But I make like a little cursive E loop, and then I get that on my needle and I snug it up. And that's just how I increase that stitch. So let's look at that one more time. So I do the backwards loop, snug it up, and keep going. And then the pattern is written, so you do 2 increases on each sleeve area, 2 increases on each body area, and that's how you get the number of stitches that you need for the body of your sweater.
And I really like that particular increase that Karina has done in this pattern. So when I was knitting my sweater, I didn't read the abbreviations, and I just saw M1 or make one. And so when I was knitting my tiny little sweater, I was doing sort of that traditional make one increase where I was picking up the strand between the 2 stitches to do my increase, which definitely worked, and you absolutely can do it. But when you're talking about that tiny little sweater, I mean, it was pretty fiddly to try to pick up that strand in between on a, US size 1 or 2 needle. So that backward loop make one and that's a pretty clever increase. Is that an increase that you use on like larger sweater patterns? Do you use it for other things too, or was it more just because we're knitting such a tiny little thing here?
I've used it a lot. I actually went on a retreat with another designer, and she was talking about that's all she ever used all the time. And I'm like, I never used that increase. And then I started using it in some things, and I'm like, okay, it's basically invisible. It's easy to work. It doesn't take up, like if you do a knit front and back, you're actually using up a stitch kind of when you do that, because you have to knit into the front and the back of one stitch. So it is really nice. if I need to be able to see where my increases are, I have a tendency to use a knit front and back because it makes that, we call it a purl bump, but it's not really a purl bump. It makes that a little bump and it's easier to count. But for something like this, it really does work easily and you can kind of see. So this was my original, let me twist this a little bit. This was my original knit 3 that was the sleeve here. I'm gonna put the needle through there so we can see. And you can see from the rib, this line just runs down and that's all of those increases and they're very neat and they're very tidy. I haven't done anything to this or blocked it or anything, but they're just easy to do for something like this. And I think when you're doing fun things like this, making it as easy as possible is fun.
Yeah, that's great. That's a really good increase to know. I'm going to start using that in everything too.
Right?
Yeah. Well, it's so easy.
It's so easy, and it's just one of those things. And it's always good to have lots of different methods and tips and tricks in your tool bag.
Yeah.
You know, the more ways that you know how to do things, the more that you can say, okay, the designer said this, but I really think that this will work, and I like the way it looks. And you can. It's your knitting. You can make that executive decision about your own knitting. And that's what I tell people. If you like the way it looks and it works, and if it needs to fit a human and it fits the human or your dog or whatever, or if, brave enough to put it on a cat, then, if it works, it works. And I just think, that we just need to enjoy things more.
Yeah, just enjoy your knitting. But yeah, that's a great increase for this.
So I'm going to turn this upside down. This is actually what we would call the yoke or the raglan yoke of my sweater. And I've got it on the double points. So that was the other way that you could knit this. And like I said, you can do double points, you can do magic loop, and you can do, some people do socks on 2 circulars. You could do a little sweater like this on 2 circulars just as easily. But what we're gonna do now is we're looking at this and we're actually going to be separating for the sleeves and the body. So I'm gonna use a double point here and I'm gonna be knitting across this row and or across this portion, and then we're going to put the sleeves on waste yarn. And the reason that we put the sleeves on waste yarn is we're going to come back to them later and be able to use them. So we basically just knit across, and I'm going to get to the point of one of the sleeves, and I'm going to put the sleeve on the waste yarn. And like I said, I should have a different career because I'm the slowest knitter.
That's fine. We've got time.
Most people know. I've actually had people say, are you sure you're a knitting designer? And I'm like, well, that's why when I did a sweater book, I hired people to knit most of the sweaters. But when we're going to put it on the waste yarn, with something like this, you could actually probably use a little stitch holder if you had one. But the waste yarn is kind of nice because it's foldable and you're not stretching things out and stuff. So I just take a needle and a yarn needle or a tapestry needle, and I'm using a big one because this is big yarn. And then one of my favorite tricks is to thread a yarn needle, is that, I'm gonna move this out of the way, is that you fold the yarn in half and feed it through. And it's like super easy and it goes in super fast, and then I don't have to work with this frayed end that I broke and didn't cut, obviously. So then all we're gonna do when we get to the sleeve stitches is we're just gonna slip them from the tip of the double point onto the tapestry needle. That's my increase there, so it's a little trickier. But we're gonna slip all those over. And then the one thing I will tell you to do, and I'll tell you to do this because I've done it wrong and I have regretted it, when you get all of your sleeve stitches onto the waste yarn, you're gonna have your little length of yarn. The double points are probably hiding there what I'm doing. So set that down, making the clacky noise. Once you get this, tie it in a knot. Always tie it in a knot.
Tie it in a knot.
You think, oh, this yarn is so long, the stitches aren't gonna go anywhere, and then you catch the stitches in something and they all unravel and you're sad. And if you're on a deadline, like I usually am when things like that happen, you're extra sad. So then you can kind of see it's starting to look like a sleeve.
Yeah, and that's really great too. So when I was knitting the plain one, and again, because you're doing it on the larger yarn so we can see it very easily on on video. But when I was knitting that tiny one, I actually used like one of those locking stitch markers. That's usually what I use a lot, like if I'm doing like mittens or fingerless mitts to hold my stitches to like finish a thumb or something. And so on that little sweater, I took a tiny little locking stitch marker instead of the waste yarn to hold my stitches. But on those tiny little sweaters, it really was just more in my way than anything else. So I feel like the waist yarn's probably the easiest way to go with this, because like you said, it's foldable.
Yeah,
so.
and you can see, like, this is my not finished sweater here, where I've got, you know, the sleeves bow something, and you see I got my knots. I did as I say, not as I do, which, you know, a lot of times I'm like, do as I say, not as I do, because I make those mistakes and I make them over and over again, and it's like, when are you going to learn? When are you going to learn to take notes? When are you going to learn to tie the knots and the things? So I'm going to tell you how to do it the good way, so that you don't have the things that I have. So what we've done so far, we cast on with our little tiny neckline. We did that twisted ribbing, and you can see the twisted ribbing. I'm going to grab one of my needles really nicely here, how it makes the nice strong lines of the rib. And it's like 3 rounds of ribbing.
Yeah, it's very short ribbing.
So it's not like you're doing like what you would have where you're doing like a sweater for a human and you've got like 20 rounds of ribbing. It's only 3 rounds of ribbing. So doing them twisted like this makes them stand out nicely. And then once you've done that and you start doing the increases for the body, and we showed you the little guy there where we had all the increases for the body done, and I showed you the little lines. We've got both of the sleeves on waist yarn, and then you do some make ones on the side of this, and then it's just knitting in the round. Now, I'm going to show you the other versions just to talk about it a little tiny bit. When you're doing the plain version, you just knit in the round the whole time. When you're doing the cabled version, there's actually instructions right at the beginning where we increase some stitches for the cables, and then we work the cable on the front of the sweater all the way down. And we always increase stitches for the cables because cables snug everything up, and we want it to be the same size on the front as it is on the back, which of course it's not as important because, you know, it's hanging on a Christmas tree or in a garland or whatever. But it gives you instructions in the pattern to do the cabling if you want to do the cables. And these look like super fancy, like I call it a braided cable, but it really is just like the simplest of cable.
Because is it a 6-stitch wide or 9-stitch?
It is a 6-stitch wide cable where you do a 2x2, I'm left, right impaired, and I'm sorry, where you do a 2x2 left cross on one of the rows, like row 1, and then on row 3 you would do the 2x2 right cross. And that's what makes it do this nice,
the nice braided
back
thing.
and forth kind of braided. And it's so pretty and it's so simple, and people sometimes get intimidated by cables, but it's just working the stitches out of order.
And this would be a perfect thing if you're new to cables, because you're just doing those basic 4-stitch wide cables. And it's just very few of them on this tiny little thing. So
So it is a good, and also if you know how to do cables with a cable needle and you wanted to practice cabling without a cable needle, which I know we have lots of videos for, this is a great little project to do that, because, you know, it's not too big and it gives you an opportunity to practice the different skills.
So let's see, while you're getting ready here with your next little step here, I'm going to just check to see if we have any comments. And again, if you have any questions or comments, go ahead and leave them in the chat box, because we'll be happy to answer any of your questions and see your comments. Darla says, I'm happy to see a slow knitter who is a pro. I'm a slow knitter too. Anyone can be a knitting pro. It doesn't matter how fast you knit, right?
I literally remember we were at a trade show in Phoenix, and there was one of the ladies that I'm friends with that works for one of the yarn companies, and she's watching me knit, and she's tilting her head a little bit, and she's like, do you always knit that slowly? And I'm like, yes. And she's like, but you do this for a living. And I'm like, also yes.
Yeah.
And it was like, but like I said, for me, I know exactly how quickly I knit. I love to knit. I mean, I do it so much, like, you know, especially when we're staying home all the time. You know, my husband and I are going through all these different series that we love to watch, and I knit through all of it. So I always have time to knit. And then, of course, once the boys got older and the kids are grown, and the kids are grown. How are the kids grown? The kids are grown, and, you know, you have more time for that. But I also, like I said, when I was doing a sweater book, or both of the books, I farmed it out to people that were faster.
Yeah, and I do think when, like, you do sort of transition knitting as a hobby into a job, like you said, like, I know how long now it takes to knit a sweater or knit socks or knit a shawl, so you work that into your working time, because you know, oh, it's going to take me X amount of hours to do this pair of socks. And for some people, that might be 8 hours, and for some people, that might be 40 hours, you know, but you learn how to like work it in.
Do it. Actually, when I do my time estimates for designing, I always say, this is how fast I knit. I know that I knit 1,350 stitches per minute.
Whoa.
Not per minute, per hour. Oh my goodness. 1,300, I know that that's the math, and you're probably way faster if you figure it out. I do the calculations and then I double it, because I know that it's going to take me twice as long as I think it's going to. But that's the nice thing about these little sweaters. They are so fast. Like, you can knit them. I will tell you that you can knit them. I keep putting it upside down in an episode of Midsummer Murders, because we're trying to go through all of those. And so I definitely can get one done like in an hour and a half or so.
Yeah.
And it's just a fun little thing. It would be cute as like a package tag too.
Oh yeah, it's like a little tag on a gift. Yeah, that would be cute.
Okay.
Let's see, we do have one. Oh, Mary says, I love that easy increase. I have never seen it before. Yes, that's something that I never thought about, that backwards loop increase, until I saw Karina using it in patterns. Yeah.
Well, and some people use it as their actual cast on. I'm not fond of it as an actual cast on for a couple of reasons. One, you know, like I said, this doesn't need to fit anybody's head, but it's tight. Also, the backward loops cast on is very easy to, like, the loop will slip off the needles. And like I said, if you're doing it for whatever, you could get frustrated. If you're doing it on a deadline, you could cry like me. So, you know, sometimes it's not, but that increase is just so nice in the middle of your knitting. So.
Yeah, great. We've got one last question. Stacy just wants to know if this will be available for viewing later, and the answer is yes. So you will be able to come back and watch this video later, and so that way if you miss any of the steps, or you want to see Karina do the increases or the ribbing or whatever again, you absolutely can come back and watch the video again. Okay, Karina, take it away.
Okay, I'm going to turn this around like this. That made a lot of noise. So we got our sweater. Got our sleeves on the hold. We did our body, and the body for the main one is just knit every round. You knit, you knit, you knit, and you knit for a couple of inches. And you can kind of play with it if you want to make it longer or shorter. Like if it looks better in your yarn to do less than 2 inches, you can make that decision. Or if your gauge turns out really small, like you end up with the tinier version of the sweater. It looks so little next to
I know it does.
Okay, this is bulky yarn in
yeah.
its defense, so it's chonky yarn.
Yeah.
But it just looks so little. But if you look at that and you're like, oh, 2 inches is too much, or you're gonna run out of yarn, just stop. So we've got our thing, and then we went back to our knit one through the back loop, purl one ribbing. So I have bound off in pattern, and binding off in pattern is one of those easy things, but it just makes things look nicer. And this is a sweater for a tree or a present or just for fun. But some of those little details are just nice.
Yeah.
So what we're gonna do, and I've done most of it, but I wanna show you the rest if I can find my working yarn. So we just go and we knit through the back loop just like we normally do. And then we just do a normal bind off. We use our left hand needle tip to lift that stitch over and off. And then we're gonna go, and then we're gonna purl the next stitch. And then again, just lifting over and off. And I'm gonna do that all the way to the end just so I can take my needles out of here and not be clacking all over the table. I think that's the hardest part sometimes about doing these videos.
Yeah.
And we were doing a lot of them at home, and it's like, oh, these needles are so loud.
They're loud, yeah.
I need like sound deafening needles
Yeah.
or something like that, so that you like not having that happen.
The clicky noise. Yeah.
Well, and then you try to like elevate your hands so it's like click clacking.
Yeah.
So I'm trying not to click clack in your ears. So here is my last one. And then of course, when you bind off anything, you're gonna have that one last loop. And we're gonna take our working yarn, which I've already cut here, and you want to cut a tail so you have an end to weave in. And then when I weave in the ends on something like this, I'm going to grab my tapestry needle and thread that up. When I weave in the ends on something like this or anything, I always like to kind of not just weave it in straight, because it always leaves that weird little it makes the where the round begins and the round ends very obvious.
Yeah, it's like a little stair step.
So I like to go into where the very first stitch started, and that's right here. And I pull that into there, and then it just kind of cleans that up. Do you see how that, let me take it out a little bit so we can see. So you've got like that stair step effect, and then by pulling through there, it cleans that up. And then you can weave in your ends just like normal. Or you can be like me and you can have a sweater that has like a soft little belly because you didn't weave in the ends because it's just going on my Christmas tree.
Yeah.
So sometimes we cheat, and with something like this, it's not gonna get worn, so it doesn't matter. So ready to do the next part, which is to start working on the sleeves. So to do that, we have to get the sleeves back on the needles, and I need more needles. I always need more needles here. When you're doing the sleeve, I actually suggest, if you're doing it on double pointed needles, pointed needles usually come in a set of 5. So doing the body, and we had the divisions, I'll show you the divisions again, where we had the divisions for, you know, the sleeve in the front. That worked out really well to have 4 needles for the body and then the 5th needle as the working needle. The sleeves are a very small circumference, so sometimes it's better just to have 3. You have to have at least 3 on the sleeve. You can't just do 2 or you'll get like super bad ladders.
Yeah.
And ladders being where the place where the round or the needle ends and then there's like a big gap. So I'm going to show you how to get these back on the needles here. So the very first one and the very last one are always the worst. I don't cut the holding yarn until the stitches are back on the needles.
I do the exact same thing.
You think you're going to be like, oh, I'll go ahead and take this knot out. Don't do it. Don't make yourself sad. Or you think you can cut and like work them as one. No, don't do that. It's just better, and then you can see the stitches are right here, and can we see the blue in between?
Yeah.
There we go. And then I'm just going to go, and this had 13 stitches, so I'm going to put, let's see, here is 7 we'll put on the first needle, and then we'll put 6 on the other needle. Oh, wait, then I said I was going to do less than that. So 1, 2, 3, we'll do 4 here, and then we'll get another needle because we need 3 needles. I'm dividing it in half.
Yeah, and the other reason I like to leave my stitches, like not cut the waste yarn first, is that sometimes I find that right where you have the join, where like in this case in the underarm, sometimes as you're knitting, those stitches do, even though they're on the waste yarn, so they are secure, they almost kind of want to, it's like they're trying to ladder down or something. And so I find that having that waste yarn still in there when I'm putting them onto my needle is helpful, because then you know this is a stitch that I need to pick up. This isn't just some other lumpy thing, and then you're accidentally forgetting a stitch and having major problems.
So here at the end, you'll see this, this is the last stitch. Sometimes they want to like disappear, and that's what she was talking about, like keeping that yarn in. So sometimes it's helpful to like have an extra needle to do that, but we've got this one on the needle just fine, and it's sometimes a little tight right there.
Yeah, it can be a little tight, yeah.
So do we have scissors?
I do. I have some scissors for you right here.
I was breaking yarn in the other room when I was making sure everything was set up, and I'm like, this yarn is really tough. Usually wool is easy to break.
Yeah. Here we go. Here's some scissors for you.
Little tiny scissors.
Yeah, they're not the best scissors, but they'll do.
So, and I always cut both sides because I find I don't know which side's going to be easier to pull out, and sometimes it's easier to just go here in the middle and grab. See, wrestling porcupines, that's what I'm talking about. It's like all kinds of fitsy. Like I have never been happy making socks on double points. Like some people only make their socks on double points, and no, then you know, that's how you poke yourself.
Yeah.
So we've got 3 needles. It makes like a little triangle-y thing here. Got our 3 needles, and then we're gonna get some working yarn back here, and then you just join the yarn, and you start off and you go ahead and knit around those stitches, and we're gonna do a make one at the end. Or you can pick up at the end. There's sometimes a little underarm gap here, so you can just kind of go through and pick up that as a stitch. So I think that's what I'm gonna do here, is I'm just gonna put the little portion that's under the arm here on the needle and count that as a stitch, and then I'm just gonna start knitting in the round. And like I said, you can do this on the other versions. You can do it on the magic loop. You can do it on the, and Michelle, a friend of ours, Michelle, she uses flexi flips, which are like double pointed needles that have a bendy part in the middle. I've never used
They're like
those.
shorter. They're basically like a really, almost like kind of like a short, it's like almost like a kind of like a really short circular, like, but so it's like, it's kind of like a hybrid between a double point and a circular needle.
I've never used those before, and it's like, oh, I need to get myself some of those.
Yeah.
But you're just gonna knit round and round, and then when you're doing this, then we're gonna do some sleeve decreases. I'm gonna grab the sweater again so we can look at how that is. I'm gonna grab this rainbow one because it's the cutest. So you're just going to be doing some decreases along the bottom kind of edge of here. And on a normal sweater, when you're doing like a person sweater, you'll do like a decrease at the beginning and the end of the row. Well, this is just too tiny for that. So the pattern will walk you through and it'll tell you, you know, you do 2 rows of knitting and then you do a row where you knit 2 together at the end, or the next, and then you do 2 more rounds of knitting. And I'm saying rows, it should be rounds because we're going round and round. You're doing 2 more rounds of knitting and then you do a round where you do a knit 2 together at the beginning. And so that kind of balances that out. And then when we finish the sleeve portion of it, we're gonna finish the sleeve portion of it. We're gonna do a couple more rounds. I think it's just 2 rounds of the ribbing. And then, like I said, I like to bind off in pattern, but that's just a personal preference. The whole little sweater is totally knit in the round. And then you're ready and you can weave in your ends, or you can not weave in your ends if you're not like me. So I wanted to take a look, and you can see if there's other questions, but I wanted to take a look at the color work version of the sweater.
We don't have any questions in the chat, but if you do have a question, be sure to leave it in the chat. I have a question for you though.
Okay.
Okay, so when I was knitting the sleeves in the round, like we were saying on that tiny little sweater, I did mine using magic loop because that's my preferred method for knitting in the round. But it can be a little bit fiddly for some, and we're talking about a very, very small circumference here. You could knit the sleeves flat. You would kind of have to work some things out on your own, but it would be possible to knit the sleeves flat and then kind of seam them up, do you think?
You could totally do that.
Yeah.
And because it's skinny yarn, because I would normally suggest if you want them to be tiny, unless you want like a giant sweater like the one we're working on now.
Yeah.
But if you want these cute little tiny ones for the tree or the garland or the package, you're going to be using fingering weight or sock weight yarn. So if you knit this sleeve flat, and instead of doing 2 rounds of knitting, you'd be knit and then purl, you know, so that you get stockinette. You could totally just kind of whip stitch on the underneath. And actually, you know, I think that sometimes might be easier, especially for people who aren't as experienced or feel like the little sleeves are too fiddly. You could totally sleeve them. You could totally seam them up on the bottom edge, and it really wouldn't matter.
It really wouldn't matter. I guess the only thing I could see is maybe when you're doing that knit 1 through the back loop, purl 1 ribbing at the end, when you are doing the wrong side row,
you have to purl through the back loop.
You would have to purl 1 through the back loop,
which is
not hard, but I mean,
No.
it would take a little bit of planning, but if that little teeny circumference is really problematic for you, it is a solution. You could work it out and do it flat.
The only thing that I might do if you're doing that, so when you're doing the sleeves, I suggest you have 13 that are left from when you did the body. You pick up 1. I would probably pick up an extra stitch or 2, because if you end up seaming them properly, like a mattress stitch or something, you know, you're going to lose a little bit of circumference. But then again, this doesn't have to fit anybody's arms. I mean, this wouldn't even fit my pinky finger.
Yeah, that's true.
So it doesn't matter a ton, but if you want it to be the proportions, you could totally do that. And you can do that with grown-up sweaters too. Like if you don't want to knit your sleeves in the round for like an actual raglan sweater that you're doing, if you add 2 extra stitches, like 1 at the end and 1 at the beginning and 1 at the end of the row, and you knit it flat until you get to however, you know, long the sleeve is supposed to be, and you use like a nice clean mattress stitch, then you could totally do that on on a real sweater. I say a real sweater. It's a real sweater.
It's a real sweater. You just mean like a human size sweater.
On a human size sweater, or even a dog size. You know, like I saw so many cute pet things, and I'm like, and I don't have pets anymore, and I'm like, oh, no, my dog would never have worn a sweater. So we have the version here in my hands that is the color work version, and like I said, I used leftovers for things. So I used the colors I had on hand. I was looking for red and green, and then I was like, if I put red and green on the camera, then, you know, it's going to like vibrate off the page, because that would be a little, but it would be fun. Or like silver. Oh, if you had sparkly sock yarn.
Oh, sparkly sock
with
yarn.
a stellina in it. Look at us getting all excited.
Yeah, now we're
about
getting,
sparkles.
okay, now we're thinking of all the mini sweaters we're going to make when we get back home. We're going to be going through all those sock leftovers.
So this is the version that's color work, and it's in the pattern. So the PDF includes the plain version, the cabled version, and then the color work version. You could do any little color work pattern that you like. You could do it on the whole body. I wouldn't suggest doing it on the sleeves just because it's a little fiddly.
Yeah.
But on this version, I've just done a little simple 4-stitch color work at the bottom. So the only real differences in this that I did, and it's all written out in the pattern. So I'm going to grab my needle so I can have a little pointer here. So you start with, I started with my contrast color, which was this kind of coral. I did the body yoke area, all the increases in the turquoise color. And then I did the sleeves, and then I did the ribbing for the sleeves and the ribbing for the bottom in the coral, and then the color work in the coral. The one thing that I will tell you that you want to do, just for like, to make it look super perfect and cute, and it's in the instructions. When you're knitting your sleeves, for example, and you're ready to transition to the ribbing, you're gonna knit one plain round in the coral color. Because if you immediately start with your knit 1 through the back loop, purl 1 ribbing, when you purl a stitch that was turquoise in the coral, it shows like a float or like it'll show like a weird bump on the front.
Right, like you can see the other color in the ribbing.
So if you're like ever doing like a striped hat or like when you're actually striping it, not like self-striping yarn, but if you're ever doing like a striped hat or a striped anything that has ribbing and you're striping in the ribbing, if you knit those transition stitches from one to the next, you don't have to, you can just do your normal ribbing and then you can knit one plain round when you change colors. So the first round of any color you change, if you knit that, you'll avoid that. And it kind of is like a little...
It makes it like very crisp, and it really doesn't affect like the stretchiness of the ribbing, really.
You can't really tell. Like if you look at it, you'd have to be like, oh yeah, I did it. Like if you look at this, I don't know how close up y'all can see. I have it in my hand and I'm like half can't see it. But you can't really tell that there's a plain knit round before this ribbing. It just looks like the ribbing starts happening. But you definitely want to do that, and that is written in the pattern. And I did this in a stranded colorwork style. So it's, you know, knit 1 in turquoise, knit 1 in the coral, and it tells you that in the pattern. But you could do like a little slip stitch band, anything you want. The body of the sweater has 32 stitches in it. So if you have anything that will fit in 32 stitches and you want to put it around the body of the sweater, you totally can. Anything that's divisible by 2, 4, 8.
Yeah.
Is that all the numbers I get? 16. If you had a 16 stitch pattern that you wanted to do all the way across one. And I say I'm a math person and I couldn't figure out the math on the fly.
It's hard on the fly to do the math in your head.
But you can totally do like any kind of patterning that you want to do on it. It comes with this patterning, but that's like a fun way to decorate. And it's also a fun way to use up all those little tiny bits of sock yarn or fingering weight yarn that you have left over. And like I said, I didn't weave in my ends on this. So I just kind of tucked them in there and it looks like it's like a little fat belly.
Yeah, I really like that because I did weave in the ends on the rainbow sweater when I made it, and it was on those sleeves, and my gauge was definitely a little bit tighter than yours. It was not easy to weave in the ends on those sleeves. I did it, but it was
and it's hard to turn them inside out because they're so tiny. It's like this tiny little circumference.
I might have actually done it just from the right side and just kind of like carefully worked it in. It was a little tricky.
But like I said, you really don't need to do it. You can knot it and trim it, and because it's not going on anything, you never want to knot and trim like something someone's going to wear, because then it'll come undone and then everybody's sad. So the last thing that I want to talk about with the sweaters, and I'm going to demo something else for you, is how we're going to hang our sweaters up. So when I told my husband that I was making mini sweaters, he 3D printed me little hangers.
Those are so cute.
He's like, well, how wide do they need to be? How tall do they need to be? And I'm like, well, here's the sweater. And he took out he measured, this should be 2 inches wide and it needs to be, and he printed out prototypes. So we have those, and not everyone has a crazy husband with a 3D printer that will do that. Jen actually found little tiny sweater hangers online, and so on Amazon or whatever, and they're super cute. They're like wood with the little metal thing. You can also take a normal ornament hanger, because those are super bendy wire, and just kind of feed it in. But the other thing that you can do is you can actually attach, and I'm going to take these needles out of my mini guy and just let them be loose and free. You can actually attach a loop to your mini sweater, and the way that you can do that is 2 ways. You can use a needle and thread and sew on some pretty ribbon, like some sparkly ribbon would be really nice, or you can use the tail that you had and keep a nice long tail, and I'm gonna Houdini this. So when I did,
oh, it's ready to go.
It's ready to go.
Through the magic of television.
So, so we're gonna keep pulling and pull out. It's like that thing with the handkerchiefs.
Yeah.
So this is the tail, and well, we got an extra tail in here. We need to tuck that back inside. So if you use the tail, if you use a very long tail on the cast on yarn that you use, you can crochet a little hanging loop. So that's what I'm going to do here. And I've got my handy dandy crochet hook. And if you're a knitter and you don't have a whole lot of crochet hooks, we're just crocheting a chain. And crocheting a chain is just pulling a loop through a loop.
Yeah. It's the easiest thing you can do in crochet, and any knitter can really learn how to do it.
So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna insert my crochet hook into the back neck of this sweater, and I'm gonna pull through the first loop. And then I've got this long tail of yarn, and then I'm just going to, so this is how I hold my yarn when I crochet. Different people hold it different ways. But it's like the fundamental crochet maneuver. It's making a chain is how you start pretty much anything in crochet. So we've got our crochet hook, and you want a crochet hook that's roughly about the same size as the knitting needles that you used, just because it's going to work the best with the yarn that you've used. So I'm going to take the head of my crochet hook and I'm going to wrap my working yarn over it, and I'm going to pull through that loop. And I'm just going to keep doing that until, and I think I tell you in the pattern maybe 20 stitches, but that might be too many depending on where you're hanging it. But you want to do it until you have a chain. I split my yarn here. This yarn is nice, but it's definitely
a little
it's
splitty.
splitty because it's only a 2-ply. I love working with a sock yarn though because it's like all nice and tight.
Yeah,
I think.
it's like really
So once
twisted.
you have the chain long enough and you want to kind of fold it over and test it, is that going to be long enough to hang wherever I want it to hang? So I'm going to do a few more because I want it a little bit longer. Then you can go ahead and I'm going to just cut this again because we've got too much yarn here. Too much yarn.
Yeah, there's no such thing.
Do we say too much yarn? So then when you've got your last loop and you've got your short little guy here, I'm going to pull this all the way through, and then that just kind of finishes off the chain. And then I can use my tapestry needle to tack that into place.
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah.
And then you have a cute little chain loop that you can use to hang it wherever. And this is another thing, like I said, we could use ribbon. So you could get like a pretty ribbon, but if you had like a pretty contrasting color yarn that you wanted to use, or if you're like me and you're a little bit crazy and you think, oh, I want it to be dark green so it blends into the tree. I don't know. So the other thing that Jen and I were talking about when we were planning out the sweaters is some of the things that you could do with the plainer sweaters. Like with the cable one, obviously, you're not going to want to put anything on it. But you could take a needle and thread and sew sequins on. If you had like a little, like, I feel like it would be good if it was like a super gaudy one, like a super like flashy, sparkly patch.
Ooh.
If you had like a super sparkly like Christmas patch or like a little bell or whatever, you could iron it on to the front of the sweater. You could use a regular sticker with some extra glue and put little stickers. You could have a crazy mini Christmas sweater contest and see who could make the ugliest Christmas sweater.
The ugliest mini
Christmas sweater.
Christmas sweater.
I feel like we should ask people to make us ugly mini Christmas sweaters and send us pictures.
Yes,
because,
please tag us on Instagram.
Right? Because that would be like, now I want to make like a whole garland of that for my house.
I know, yeah.
Like a whole just like the ugliest Christmas sweaters you can find.
We do have a couple questions here. Stephanie is wondering, how do we get the pattern? And you can get the pattern if you just scroll up in the chat roll. You'll be able to see the link so that you can download it, or it should have come to your email as well. But the link is in the chat roll. And then Susan would like to know a little bit more about our sweater hangers. Where did they come from, handmade or purchased? So maybe we can go over that again as well.
So like I said, I'm taking it out and I have one. So this one was one that my husband made me out of 3D plastic.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Because he's just, he gets a kick out of that thing.
That's really cool.
And I was having trouble finding them online because some places were out of stock.
Yeah.
But the ones that Jen has here that have gotten hidden under my pile of stuff are, they're just like little, I'm gonna put them on the sweater because it's easier to see. They're little wooden ones. So they're like, and they've got like the little dowel, like, I feel like you could hang like tiny pants on them.
Yeah, I just found the little wooden one here. I just found it online. Basically what I did was when I was done with my sweater, I just took my tape measure and measured across it. And I mean, I'm sure the dimensions are in the pattern, but again, nobody's checking their gauge, so your sweater might be slightly different size.
Really? Just a couple of inches.
It's really, I think that the ones I bought, I think it was 1.8 I think it was 1.85 or something inch wide hanger. So I basically measured my sweater, and then I just went online and Googled like 2-inch sweater hanger and found these. And I was able to get like a package of like 5 or 8 or something like that for just like $6. So, you know, when you make your collection of mini sweaters, you'll have the hangers ready to go. And I think too, like if you were just going to keep it, I mean, those hangers really are not going to come off, but if you were worried about like the hanger somehow coming up out of your sweater, I guess you could really like just take some craft glue even and just kind of like glue it in there, and then it would be pretty permanent.
I think these are kind of like dollhouse like ones.
Yeah, they really, yeah, I think it was like
I don't know the scale on dollhouses though.
Yeah, I don't know, but yeah, it really was. I think it was like the company. I mean, I found them online, but like the company that makes them, I do think that they make other like dollhouse things. And I love how you were talking about like the embellishments and things like that. That's really cool. If somebody's into like embroidery or duplicate knitting, where you can just sort of you could make all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, duplicate stitch would actually be fun because you could do, because I personally believe that intarsia is not a happy thing. I do not like intarsia knitting.
Intarsia fan.
Intarsia is the kind of knitting where instead of doing stranded knitting, you're only knitting with blocks of color in a certain area. Like if I wanted to put like a little Santa face on the front of this, that would be intarsia and I would cry. So, but you can do duplicate stitch knitting, which is where you actually stitch over the little V's of the stitches, and you go in and out where the stitches go in and out, and you cover them or duplicate stitch them, and you could totally stitch something on there. But embroidery would be, now I think I want fancy ones. See, I was thinking I wanted like a whole collection of ugly ones, but now I feel like I want fancy ones that have like French knot flowers and.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's so many. I mean, that's the cool thing about knitted fabric is, yeah, you can embroider some fancy things, or like even if you did some planning ahead, if you wanted to like knit some beads into the body of the sweater or something,
you
like
could knit beads. Ooh, some beads would be really cute, like around the ribbing, right before you did the ribbing, you could do those little sparkly beads.
Oh yeah, that would be really. There's so many different things that you could do with this. I mean, it's just really. You would think a tiny little sweater, like how could you possibly like make it different? But there's so many options for
there's
like
lots
what
of options, and like I said, it's super fun and it's super fast, and it's just one of those things that it's like. It's just fun to have. Like I was like so excited, and I was in a business group meeting, and they're like, "Oh, what are you working on?" And I'm like, "I'm making a tiny little sweater." And they're like, "Oh, yeah, I want tiny little sweaters." And I'm like, "No, these are for work.
Yeah,
can't have them."
So when you're knitting sweaters, again, this is just a question I have. So when you're knitting sweaters, would you say that the top-down raglan is sort of your like favorite or go-to sweater shape or style of knitting a sweater? Do you have like a go-to sweater type that you like?
As a person who lives in Florida,
well, you don't need a lot of sweaters.
I don't need a lot of sweaters, but I definitely think that raglan or top-down sweaters are great for people who have never knit a sweater to fit themselves before.
Yeah, I
agree.
Because
one of the fabulous things about a top-down sweater is that you can put the whole sweater on waist yarn and try it on your body and know if it fits across your shoulders, know if it's going to fit across your bust, or know if the neckline is going to strangulate you. Because I hate things that
I don't like.
That's what's nice about Florida is you don't have turtlenecks. But the top-down sweater construction, I think, is really great for a first sweater, especially because when you're knitting, so we'll use this little guy because it's probably the easiest to see. So right here, this is going to be like the depth from your neckline down to your armpit. And if there's not enough fabric there to reach your armpits, that you need to knit more of this yoke, even if it's just plain and you're not increasing. And there's a lot of information out there about that, but I really think that raglan or top-down sweaters are great for that. And I think it's a confidence builder. Because when you're knitting like a tube of a body that's gonna, you can take that off and you can put it on your body, but you don't know if it's gonna, how big around your body is, and that's the easy part to fit.
That is, yeah.
The harder part to fit is your shoulders. How deep, they call it the arm side is, how deep the under, how do you want that to fit? Is it gonna, like the neckline gonna be right? Is it gonna fit bust-wise and stuff like that? So I think that top-down is great for that. I have knit top-down sweaters for myself. I'm currently working one that's a drop because that's so forgiving. And I had hoped to have it to wear it in Minnesota, but I didn't finish it in time. So, because I was getting ready to come here. So.
Yeah, I will agree. Like I do love the top-down sweaters for that reason, is that they're so easy to try on. So if you haven't knit a sweater before, this is like the perfect little thing to even just try sort of like the basic shape of it and just practice it a little bit on the teeniest little thing before you go and move up to an actual real person sweater.
Because like I said, when you do one of these sweaters, like let's say we're just going to point at the simplest one. When you make this sweater, you have done everything that you need to do for a top-down raglan sweater for a human being.
Yeah.
Everything. You've done the neckline, you've done the increases for the raglan yoke, you've done, doing the body, you've done the ribbing, you've done picking up the stitches for the sleeves. It's everything that you need to do, and it's just in a miniature version. I know a lot of teachers who, when they teach raglan classes, I've not taught raglan classes in the past, but I know teachers who teach raglan classes, and this is what they do. This is how they walk you through so that you have the confidence to create a sweater that will work for you. And actually, it's like a super great gauge swatch, because if you're knitting a pullover sweater like this, where it's not a cardigan, it's closed, you need to know that your gauge is in the round.
Right.
So with this, you're getting a very accurate gauge in the round, which is more fun than knitting a gauge swatch in the round, because they're not fun.
Right. I mean, and that's the thing, is we were kind of talking at the beginning about how like this, you're not going to do a gauge swatch for this, but yes, you could, like if you were going to make yourself a fingering weight sweater that was just stockinette stitch, this could just be your gauge swatch for that, basically. I mean, why not?
Well, some people, like when you're doing different types of sweaters, like some people will say that they use their, like if they're doing a sleeve from the cuff up, they'll use that as their gauge swatch. Like if they get so far in the sleeve and the gauge is off, then they know. But with the top-down sweater, I think that something like this is kind of a fun way. But like I said, it's really great practice to learn, and they, even for like super slow knitters like me, they knock out super quickly, and you can do pretty much anything. It was really fun, like digging through and trying to find different yarns. And then when Jen did one of the samples for me to test the pattern, she's like, blah, 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 rainbows. And I'm like, oh, that's so perfect.
Yeah, and with that rainbow sweater, I just started with the blue at the top, and I didn't really know how when it was gonna start switching to that rainbow. And it was pretty much perfect. I think there was like one little bit of purple I mean, I could have just knit a couple more rounds and
to get the
purple, but yeah. So, and that's the thing is, it was so fun, like digging through all my sock yarn leftovers, because I've kept every little bit of yarn left over from a project.
It's very difficult to throw yarn away.
It is. It really is. And I'm like very into doing little cute things with the leftover sock yarn. So this is the perfect project for that. Before we go, let's see. We have a question from Brenda. And Brenda says, thank you for adding another project to my Christmas list. These look easy enough to complete for the family before Christmas. How long does it take you to create one? So how long do you think, like just the basic one, like how long do you think it took you to make one? As a slow knitter.
I know that I finished this one, which is a little more complex and has a few more stitches in it, the cabled one, in an episode of Midsummer.
And that's like an hour and a half.
That's like an hour and a half.
Yeah, and I think it took me about an hour or so to do the plain one that I did, I would say.
And I think once you've done one, like if you've never done this kind of construction before, I think once you've done one, then the second one you're just like,
right, like that's a good point, is like you and I have knit human-sized sweaters before, so for us, we already kind of know how the construction was gonna go, so maybe your first one might take you 2 hours, but then going forward, it's gonna be a lot faster.
You just need to find a good holiday movie to watch.
It's just,
make a cup of hot cocoa.
Yeah.
Be ready to go.
That's perfect. Well, we seem to have taken all of our questions. Do you have any parting thoughts, or want to let anybody know anything else about sweater knitting?
I think the thing that I would say to anybody, and especially people that are newer to knitting, I always say that my favorite kind of knitter is an adventurous beginner. And because once you learn how to knit and purl, and casting on I think is sometimes harder than knitting and purling. But once you learn like those very basic building blocks of knitting, you can do anything. You can really just, everything else is just a combination of knit and purl. You're wrapping the yarn this way before you knit. You're knitting a cable. You're knitting the stitches out of order by using a cable needle or manipulating them. And I think people like get a little bogged down sometimes that this is an advanced project or this is an intermediate project. it's all just knits and pearls.
Right, yeah.
It's knits and pearls in some combination. Sometimes you wrap the yarn around to make some kind of crazy thing, and let's smock it or whatever, but it's still just knits and pearls.
I agree. Yeah.
Knits and pearls and wrapping the yarn.
Yep, so just go for it. So, well, thank you, Karina, for showing everybody how to make this. This is so cute, and I know I'm going to definitely go home and make a few more for my tree. So if you didn't already, be sure that you download the patterns so that you can make one for yourself. And so, on behalf of Karina, I'm Jen Lucas. Thank you so much for watching. Happy holidays and happy knitting. Bye.